"We've got some big news for you," my father said. His smile stretched wide, like he was handing me a gift I wasn't ready for. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded stiffly in her lap. On the coffee table between them, a plain white envelope sat like a silent promise. I waited, but the air felt heavy. The room smelled faintly of pine and old dust. The Christmas tree in the corner blinked with uneven lights, its branches sagging under the weight of tired ornaments. "It's a fantastic opportunity," my mother added. "Early college admission, a paid internship in Chicago." I frowned, confused. I hadn't applied for anything in Chicago. I hadn't heard of any program. "You'll be independent," my father said, his voice sweet with the kind of warmth that masked something colder underneath. "You're ready for this. It's the best thing for all of us." My stomach twisted at the words. All of us, not me. In the corner, my grandmother shifted, her cane tapping once on the floor. "Maybe Emma should have a say," she murmured, barely audible. Neither of them turned to her. "It's already decided," my father said, his tone final. "The paperwork's signed. Flights are booked. You leave the day after Christmas." My breath hitched. No conversation, just a ticket out, a one-way departure. That night, dragging my duffel bag behind me, I heard their voices through the crack in the study door. It was ajar, and their words slipped out. "It's cleaner this way." My father's voice was low, but firm. No distractions, no liabilities before the merger. She'd have ruined everything. My mother's reply was just a whisper. Better to keep her out of sight. I gripped the strap of my bag until the nylon cut into my palms. I wasn't leaving for an opportunity. I was being erased. No one came to the door when I stepped outside. The porch light stayed dark. The snow under my sneakers cracked sharply beneath me, and the cold sliced through my jacket as I walked without looking back. The streetlights shrinking behind me. They hadn't sent me away for my benefit. They'd thrown me out to protect themselves. I spent Christmas Eve in a cheap motel off the highway, the kind with a flickering neon sign and that familiar smell of damp carpet. I sat on the bed, still in my jacket, picking at a vending machine sandwich while the muted holiday specials droned on in the background. The silence felt suffocating, heavier than the cold outside. I kept checking my phone, even though I already knew. No calls, no messages, not even a Merry Christmas from anyone. Christmas morning came, and I unlocked my screen out of habit more than hope, and, as expected, there was nothing. Against my better judgment, I opened social media. My feed exploded with pictures from home, the living room brighter than I remembered, the tree perfectly trimmed, everyone grinning with forced cheer. Evan stood at the center, flanked by my parents, all polished and proud. The caption read, "Proud to celebrate another year with our one and only shining star." I stared at the photo, my fingers tightening around the phone. There was a gap where I should have been, not blurred, not even acknowledged, just gone. 2 weeks later, my Uncle James called. For a moment, a flicker of hope stirred. Maybe, just maybe, someone had realized. But before he got through his second sentence, I knew better. "They needed some of my old school records," he said, like it was urgent. "I'll send them over." He didn't ask how I was, didn't offer a single word of comfort. "I'll send them," I replied, and hung up before he could muster an apology that wasn't meant. Days blurred. I found work stocking shelves at a 24-hour grocery store and spent nights curled into a lumpy motel mattress. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of home on the news, Evan being interviewed about the family legacy, my parents, standing proudly behind him, always smiling for the camera they had always cared more about than me. The sting didn't hit as sharply anymore. It had settled deep inside, quieter, like a stone sinking to the bottom of a frozen lake. I understood now. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been erased, carefully, completely, and if I wanted to exist again, I'd have to rebuild somewhere they couldn't touch. It was early February when Mr. Dalton found me. I was leaving the grocery store after a long night shift, the first light of day scraping across the icy parking lot. He stood by his rusted pickup, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his breath puffing white in the cold. "Emma," he called, his voice familiar, slow, the same drawl I remembered from childhood. I froze. Part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't heard, to slip back into the dark, but something in the way he moved, hesitant, uncomfortable, made me stop. He shuffled closer, pulling out a folded sheet of paper from inside his jacket. "I wasn't sure if I should give you this," he said, "but you deserve to know." I took the paper with fingers stiff from the cold. It was a printed email chain, the headers still visible, dates circled in red ink, my parents' names at the top. The words blurred for a moment, whether from the wind or something else, I couldn't say. Liabilities must be cleared before the merger. Emma's situation creates instability. Action must be taken before year-end family review. Each line cut deeper than the last. Not just a decision, a plan, a clean, clinical removal, like cutting out a bad investment. I folded the paper with steady hands, tucking it into my jacket. "Thank you," I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. He nodded, his eyes full of something like pity. As I walked away, my breath curling into the freezing air, I understood. The truth had always been there, in the forced smiles, the careful words, the love they gave only when it looked good in public. They hadn't just pushed me out, they'd planned it. And now, it was time for me to build something they couldn't destroy. They had signed it, sealed it, and moved on, just another business transaction. Now, I finally understood, I wasn't the black sheep, I was the cost of doing business. For weeks, the paper from Mr. Dalton burned a hole in my pocket, a constant reminder that my exile wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was business, cold, calculated, and necessary, at least for them. When the weather warmed enough to turn the sidewalk slushy, I found myself at a public library computer, scrolling through news articles I had avoided. I typed my family's company name into the search bar and sifted through pages of glowing coverage, awards, charity galas, interviews. Evan's face was everywhere, polished, confident, shaking hands with politicians and business moguls. But deeper down, past the headlines and polished images, was a quieter story. Financial journals, tucked away mentions of debts, lawsuits quietly settled, vendors left unpaid for months, tiny cracks that anyone paying attention would have noticed. I dug deeper, pulling reports from court filings and business registries. It didn't take long to find the skeletons Evan had been so careful to hide. Bad investments, inflated property prices, sold at a loss, shell companies hiding money to preserve a facade of perfection. The empire wasn't just faltering, it was rotting from the inside. My family hadn't sent me away to teach me independence. They had erased me to save Evan's crumbling empire. A picture-perfect family, with only one golden son, was easier for investors to swallow than a fractured one with a daughter they couldn't explain. Maybe, in some twisted way, they believed they were doing it for me. Maybe they thought struggle would make me stronger. Maybe that's how they slept at night. I leaned back in the stiff library chair, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above me, the smell of old books and stale coffee thick in the air. They hadn't just abandoned me to protect Evan, they had rewritten the story of who belonged, who mattered, and who was disposable, and they'd gotten it wrong. I wasn't broken, I wasn't lost, I was awake now, and I was just getting started. The next few weeks blurred into a routine of early mornings, late nights, and endless shifts at the grocery store. I scraped together enough to pay for a room smaller than a closet. Every dollar counted. Every sleepless hour felt like punishment for sins I hadn't committed. I wasn't building anything yet. I was just surviving. There were nights when I sat alone at the diner by the bus station, nursing a burnt cup of coffee I couldn't afford, watching families laugh over meals I couldn't even order. It would have been so easy to believe this was all I would ever have, invisible, disposable, forgotten. Then one night, a woman noticed me. She owned the second-hand bookstore next to the diner. Ms. Wren, white hair twisted into a bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. Her voice was like worn velvet, but there was something sharp in her gaze, something that reminded me of all the people who had underestimated me. "You're here late," she said as she slid into the booth across from me, uninvited but not unwelcome. I managed a tired smile and shrugged. "Long shift," I replied. She studied me for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a flyer. "We need someone at the shop, part-time, sorting, cataloging, not glamorous, but you look like someone who knows how to work." I hesitated. It could have been pity, but something in her voice, no nonsense, almost gruff, made me believe her. I took the flyer, slipping it into my jacket without promising anything. Hope was a dangerous thing when you had nothing left. The next morning, I walked into her shop before I could talk myself out of it. The smell of old paper and wood polish hit me the moment I stepped through the door. It wasn't much, a cramped back room, shelves sagging under boxes of forgotten books, but it was something. It was a place. Ms. Wren didn't ask for my resume. She handed me a clipboard and said, "Start with the biographies, they're a mess." I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. It wasn't a grand beginning. It wasn't even a plan yet, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running from the past. I was building something toward a future they couldn't erase. The bookstore didn't make me rich. It didn't make headlines. but it gave me something more important, a foothold. Every night after closing, I stayed late, reading about business models, startup histories, market trends, things I never imagined I'd be interested in. I wasn't passing time anymore, I was sharpening skills no one knew I had. 2 years later, I saw a notice on a bulletin board at the library. A local tech startup was looking for entry-level assistants. The pay was terrible, the hours were worse. I applied anyway. When they called, I was ready. At first, I did everything no one else wanted to do: fetching coffee, running errands, organizing disorganized data files. I kept my head down, but I watched, I listened, I learned. Within a year, I was no longer the one fetching coffee. I was drafting strategies, building workflows, transforming chaos into order. When the company pivoted into logistics optimization, a market most thought too complicated to touch, I was the one who raised my hand and said, "Let's do it differently." People started listening, growth followed. By the time I was 24, I wasn't just part of the company, I was leading it, quietly, relentlessly, without ever mentioning who I was or where I came from. That first Christmas after our big expansion, I walked into a small gift shop and picked out a thick wool shawl, the kind my grandmother used to knit when her hands were steady. I wrapped it carefully in brown paper and sent it with no return address. I didn't sign a card, I didn't need to. I wasn't chasing recognition, I wasn't chasing anything. I had already built something bigger than their approval could ever give me, and I was just getting started. The email came through late on a Wednesday, buried between contract drafts and quarterly reports. Clark Enterprises, desperate to modernize their collapsing logistics division, had sent a blind request for proposals. They had no idea who they were reaching. I didn't hesitate, I didn't gloat. I simply forwarded the request to my team and scheduled the meeting. It was raining when I walked into the conference room the next morning, the steady downpour muting the city into a blur of gray. I wore a simple dark suit, no jewelry, no flash, just quiet authority. No one at the front desk asked my name, they assumed I belonged. Inside, the boardroom hummed with nervous energy, papers shuffled, chairs scraped. I recognized the silhouettes around the table before their faces fully emerged. My father's rigid posture, my mother's smile, just a bit too tight, Evan fidgeting with his cufflinks like he always did when he was cornered. None of them looked up when I entered, not at first. It was the lead consultant, an old business acquaintance, who noticed me first. His eyes widened ever so slightly, lips parting in surprise before he caught himself. He leaned over to whisper something to Evan, whose head snapped up so fast it made his chair squeak. For a long moment, no one moved. The room, once filled with false warmth, turned cold enough to crack. My father's face paled, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. My mother's hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles turned white. Evan simply stared, frozen halfway between arrogance and fear. I didn't speak, I didn't need to. I walked to the head of the table, set my portfolio down, and took my seat. The contract, emblazoned with our company's letterhead, sat neatly on top, positioned where they couldn't miss it. Silence stretched, thick and oppressive. I let it. For once, they couldn't edit me out of the picture. They couldn't crop me away or pretend I wasn't there. I was the room now, I was the deal, and whether they liked it or not, the future they needed came with my name written across it. The silence thickened until their shifting grew too loud to ignore. Paper rustled. A pen clicked twice, too fast, too hard. I didn't move. I wanted them to sit with it, to feel the weight of who was across from them. Finally, the lead negotiator cleared his throat, his voice brittle. "Would you like to walk us through the contract terms?" I smiled, my voice calm, steady, nothing personal, just professional. I outlined logistics solutions, optimization strategies, delivery frameworks, everything they were desperate to hear. I kept it detached, but the contract was more than it appeared. Deep in the clauses, buried in dry language, was a carefully crafted condition. Should Clark Enterprises fail to meet performance targets within 18 months, full operational control would revert to us, quietly, legally, without further negotiation. A lifeline, disguised as a leash. When I finished, I slid the contract across the table. My father's hand hesitated over the pen. My mother leaned forward as if willing the fine print to change. "This looks thorough," the consultant said, his voice strained with forced optimism. "And you're sure the partnership terms are standard?" I met his gaze squarely. "Absolutely standard for companies committed to excellence." He nodded, pretending to understand, pretending this was still a negotiation. I watched my father sign first, his hand trembling slightly, a motion so subtle most wouldn't have noticed, but I did. My mother followed, her signature sharp, brittle. Evan added his last, the ink smudging just enough to betray the shake in his fingers. When the final signature dried, I gathered the folder with care, tucking it back into my briefcase. For a brief moment, our eyes met, mine calm, theirs hollow. They had no idea what they'd just handed me, or maybe, deep down, they did. I rose from my seat, smoothed the front of my jacket, and smiled the kind of smile I'd learned from watching them all my life, the smile that said everything without saying a word. This time, the story was mine, and they'd just signed their part without reading the ending. I stepped out into the drizzle, the kind that blurred the city into watercolor smudges. The rain cooled the heat rising in my chest, washing away the last traces of adrenaline. No one followed me, no one called my name, just like that night years ago when I walked away from home. There was no one watching. It didn't hurt the way I thought it might. No grand triumph, no flashing moment of victory, only a steady, quiet peace settling into my bones, as if a weight I'd carried too long had finally slipped free. Later that night, as I sat by my apartment window, nursing a cup of tea gone cold, a notification pinged, a message from a name I hadn't seen in years, my grandmother. It wasn't long, just a few shaky lines in her handwriting, photographed and sent. "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. I always saw you. I always loved you. I hope you know that." I stared at the screen, rain tapping gently against the window. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Some wounds didn't demand tears anymore. They had simply become part of the landscape inside me, familiar, weathered, harmless. Without thinking, I opened my banking app and arranged a quiet transfer, enough to cover her medical expenses, enough to ensure she could live comfortably, without needing anyone's permission. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. The next morning, I boxed up the old contract papers, the final signed copies bearing the signatures that had once locked me out. I tucked them away in the back of a drawer, not out of malice, but because I didn't need them displayed. Victory wasn't a trophy to hang on the wall. It was a door I had walked through and quietly closed behind me. I wasn't the story they told. I was the one they couldn't erase, and I was already far beyond their reach.